And what they're doing here is really implementing a paradigm shift in how we in Denmark deal with older citizens. So it used to be so that when a citizen got too old and fragile to take care of him or herself, we prefer for people to live in their own home for as long as possible, but we would provide some in-home assistance. So we would have nurses or social workers come and do vacuuming, maybe a bit of shopping, deliver some food. We would help people get dressed, help people take a shower once in a while, not very often, but sometimes. And the question raised by the city of Fredericia was, how can we keep doing this? When we have more and more older citizens, we have an aging population, and we actually have fewer and fewer workers we can even employ to do this, and we are not going to be able to afford it. So is the future of this service to have cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and less in-home help? Or could we reimagine and ask a different question? And the question they asked was, what would it take if we help people live the life that they would like to live and just live longer in the kind of life they would like to have, and invested in their ability to live it? And investing in it means, like in this photograph, to draw up a plan, which is the citizen's own plan for how can I become fit again, and how can I get energy again, and how can I have strength again. And so this is through physiotherapy, ergotherapy. It is by providing a lot of advice on nutrition. It is by investing also in creating better social networks between older citizens. All of this empowering them to take charge of the things that they couldn't do, but then helping them do it again. And it's not just about manual things like cleaning and getting dressed or taking a shower or shopping. It might also be the ability to take the train to the capital of Denmark, Copenhagen, and visit your grandchildren. And really creating and investing in people's independent lives. And you might think that this sounds expensive and something that would drive up costs and perhaps even something that only a welfare state like Denmark could do. But with this model, 50% of all the citizens in the regular program can do with no help at all. So the investment in their ability to keep fit means that they can simply get on with simply no public assistance. And 35% in the program can do with less public assistance. So there's a significant saving for government in this model, at the same time as you're creating more independent and thriving citizens. That model, you might imagine, is now being copied by every single city or municipality across Denmark, pretty much all 98 of them, because it's such an obvious thing to do. But this means that we're no longer guaranteeing citizens the right to a particular service. We're guaranteeing them that we will work with them to help them live the life they would like to live. It's a very big shift from a rights-based delivery of service to looking at the outcomes. It's a paradigm shift. And you can imagine that that paradigm shift might actually work in other domains than elder care as well. So how do we work more systematically to arrive at this type of solutions? And in fact, this Fredericia case, we were not involved in that in MindLab. I helped them win the National Innovation Awards though, and I would say that that case actually started, the story goes, with a workshop with a lot of stakeholders discussing and imagining the future of that kind of service. The work we do at MindLab has to do with basically starting with citizens' lives, as I mentioned earlier, to generate new insights and ideas and solutions. And there are three things that I'd like to highlight with the processes of co-creation. First, professional empathy. And really trying to understand what is it that drives human behavior and what drives outcomes. In the recent years, we've seen a lot of literature, I'm sure you're familiar with some of it, in behavioral economics. There's also been a Nobel Prize winner, Kahneman, written a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. There's a very famous book on nudging from Thaler and Sunstein. So we have quite a few examples of academia and professionals exploring new ways to understanding human behavior. And basically understanding that human behavior is not necessarily what an economist would predict in an economic model, but which is quite often unpredictable and apparently irrational. Often it turns out that actually what citizens do is quite rational to them. It just might not look that way. from a policy perspective. So how do we understand what actually motivates and drives people? Just a couple of examples. So at MindLab, we looked at the challenge of highly qualified foreign workers and why they, when they come to Denmark and work in large companies, they tend to leave again. And that's a problem. We're spending energy and time in getting them to come to Denmark, and we would actually like them to stay. But for some reason, they prefer to work in Stockholm or London or elsewhere. And we have a big pile of reports analyzing in various quantitative ways what's going on, but we've actually never sat down and just asked for the stories of what happens for people. So Sadat here, he's an engineer from India, and we spent time with him and recorded all our interviews on audio, just listening to his story of what does it feel like to arrive in the snow in Denmark in December with his family and try to make a living in Denmark. And one of the surprising things he told us was that when his second child was born in Denmark, and he wanted to give his child an Indian name, the name he wanted to give his child was not on the list of approved names in Denmark. How do you think it makes you feel if you're in a foreign country and you can't even give your child the name you want? It turns out that you can actually get an exemption from that list and give your children the name you want, but you have to go to the Danish church to find out about that. Of course, he didn't know that. And other examples was that really he was happy with his job, but his wife couldn't get access to free or cheap language education. His kids couldn't get into an English language school. Then they couldn't get into a Danish language school, and all kinds of frustrations and problems and challenges that ultimately meant that they were seriously considering leaving the country again. All of this was material and insights that we presented to a group of, a cross-ministerial group of policymakers from Foreign Office, from Ministry of Employment and the Ministry of Business, and really working with them to understand the insights and what they could do about it. And one example of what's happened since, not just because of this project, but still, is that we've built quite a few new English language schools, also in faraway locations from the capital of Copenhagen, but where actually a lot of multinational companies are establishing themselves, for example, in the windmill industry. But sometimes it takes the kind of empathy and understanding people's lives, even for cold-hearted policymakers, to really understand what is it that is needed and how can they make a difference. Another story that I often tell, and I think is significant in this context, is that just like in my country, I would assume a lot of you are trying to invest in your countries in digital government and e-government, and finding ways to create better and more effective public services through digitization. That's also what the Danish Taxation Office has been doing for the last 10 to 15 years at least. But a few years ago, they looked at the use of its digital services online and realized that the group of citizens that were the least likely and least successful in using online services was young people under 30. So the most digital generation ever in Denmark, the digital natives, were the least able to use digital services when it comes to their taxation and their incomes and so on. People who are 55, 60, 65 years old in Denmark are much better at using online digital services, and the uptake is much higher. Why? That's what you might call an innovation question. And of course, our answer was, let's go take a look. Our answer was not to make a survey, not to ask all kinds of questions randomly we could figure out about why might they not be using it. Also because we of course know that it's not because they don't have computers, and it's not because they don't have internet access that young people are not going online with the taxation office. So we sat down with Dennis here, we brought a project manager from the Ministry of Taxation, went to the southern part of the Danish islands and visited Dennis here, who's a 23-year-old carpenter who just had his first job, and we asked him whether he was aware that such a thing existed as an online service, and he was not aware. Then we said, well, why don't you just go try it? He said, fine, and we sat down with him, and he turned on his computer, and he could easily use the computer, and we helped him go into the website, and then we asked him to just tell us aloud and just speak and say what was he experiencing. And the very first line on the screen on the form that he was accessing with the taxation form said, employer paid capital pension. Now, Dennis does not know what employer paid capital pension is. And now he gets worried. And you don't want to be worried dealing with the taxation office. So what Dennis normally does, by the way, is to take his car and drive 20 miles down to the local government office and ask the nice lady, the nice clerk, to take care of his taxation papers. Of course, that's what we want him not to do. But the reason he does it, of course, is that that's easier, and somebody can translate for him and explain to him, is this some information I need to relate to, or does this not matter to me? The next thing he does, as we help him and probe along on the website, is to go in and enter his annual salary in a box that's designed for your monthly salary. Do you know how big a tax penalty you'll get if you earn 12 times as much as you actually do? So he was making a lot of mistakes, and of course that's why he would never be able to use the website. We played back the sound of his voice and his story and what he was saying to the management committee for citizen online services in the tax ministry in Denmark. I can tell you that it was very, very quiet in the room when they were listening to his voice and to what he was experiencing. And it was very, very obvious why is it that he cannot use it. And it was very, very clear why is it that another 200,000 young Danes are also not able to use the online service. It was also very clear why the 65-year-olds in Denmark love it. Because they know the system, they filled out the paper form for a year after year after year, and they become so familiar with that form, the taxation form, that when it's online, it's recognizable, it's the same thing, and it's easy for them to use, because they've trained it for a whole life. But young people haven't. Before I end my presentation, I'll tell you how it went, what happened then, what did they do with that information. Just a final example of a paradigm shift coming from starting with citizens' lives. We did a project looking at how people with an industrial injury, people who have been injured at work, experience the case management by the Danish Agency for Industrial Injury. So the whole purpose of having an industrial injury case is to receive some kind of insurance settlement, money, because of your loss of ability to work. When we interviewed people and citizens in their own lives about, in their own homes, about their experience with the government, they said that the whole case management process, and they received about 23 letters on average with all kinds of bureaucratic and technical language about their illness and what's wrong with them and what's bad and how sick are they, and doctor statements and all kinds of things. It actually makes them more sick than they already are. And the director of the agency was asking herself the question, how is it that we work as part of the Ministry of Employment, by the way, and we are an agency that is helping people go further away from the labor market, not closer to it, and we're certainly not helping them into work. Whereas the only thing the citizens really dreamed about was not so much to receive a check or money because they can't work. What they dreamed about was getting their life back and getting a job again after an injury. I am always fascinated what design and graphic design can help us do in government innovation, and here's an example of how we used graphic design. This is in Danish, you can't read all the text, but this is actually a service journey mapping of a citizen with a work injury. And this is showing that citizen's process over about 8 months of time, and all the different letters and communication channels, and the different colors are different agencies, and it's not just the agency for industrial injury, it's also local government, it's the hospital, it's your doctor, it's your union, it's your bank, it's all kinds of information you're receiving. And the green flashes are where we identified through a number of interviews with citizens where the process just is meaningless and confusing, and it breaks down. Whether it's because you wait too long, you don't receive information you understand, receive answers you can't use, and so forth. So really mapping the journey from a citizen's perspective is a very powerful way of seeing exactly where is it that this process leads to dysfunctional outcomes. Where is it, in fact, that people feel they're getting even more sick and frustrated than they were before. And the paradigm shift that the agency has since worked on to implement is simply to say, how do we then invest in people's retraining and rehabilitation and ability to find a job again? And how can we even do that in partnership with the insurance companies? Because the insurance companies, who are the ones paying the insurance, have an interest in enhancing people's ability to work, because then they do not have to pay as big an insurance if people can actually find a new job and be retrained and be reskilled. The second part of co-creation is to basically create divergence. I mentioned this already. How do we create a bigger divergence of ideas? And how do we engage our colleagues across government to actually be the ones who find the ideas? Our role at MindLab is to help provide insight and drive processes of innovation. Our role is not to get the ideas. That's the role of our colleagues, of the civil servants, of those who are decision makers. So we spend a lot of our time on very deep engagement of our colleagues so that they are the ones who take charge. They're the ones who need to both design the policies and deliver the results. And by some measures, you know, this is a study from the Wharton School. We need up to 200 unique ideas to be sure we found the best one. So how do we work with our colleagues to really expand that space into more ideas? Especially because when we get an idea, we can't be sure it's a good one. We have to mature it, develop it into concepts, test it and try it out for citizens before we can really be sure we have a good idea. So working with creative tools, brainstorming techniques, expanding the pool of ideas. This is a case where we're working with actually a national hospital in Denmark on ideas for patient care and helping people collaborate across silos of government, or in this case, collaborate, which is pretty crazy, I know. It's collaboration happening between nurses and doctors. In Denmark and many countries, nurses and doctors are not so good at collaboration. They tend to have a bit of a hierarchy between them. It's also a question of being good at prioritizing ideas and understanding how to select the best ones. And here we use a number of graphical and visual tools that are enabling people to make intelligent discussions, and not just both to build on each other's ideas, but also to make intelligent selections. Skip that one. The third piece of co-creation is to rehearse the future. And this is very, very important. It's also very important to remember that what I'm presenting here is not necessarily a step-by-step process. It's actually dimensions that you can go into and start with each of them. So you can also start with this piece, which is about trying things out in practice. It's very important, and this is what has also got to do with what I would call a design-driven, design-oriented approach to public innovation. Basically, as designers would do, start with creating the product, or start with creating a prototype of what a future might look like. And a prototype is not necessarily a model of a car or of a chair. It could also be a model of a service. It could be a prototype for a service journey like the one, the graphical service journey I just showed you a moment ago, saying what do we want this to look like instead. And then testing with citizens, with businesses, with end users, what could actually create value for them. So it can be at all kinds of levels. This is a case example. I was chairman of a European Union committee looking at how do we enhance public sector innovation across the 28 member states and 500 million citizens in Europe. And here we're testing out at MindLab, we're testing out a policy idea we had. This guy here in the picture is a professor of political science in Estonia, and he's presenting our ideas in the committee to our users, which were policymakers in government. And the gentleman sitting here in the black shirt, he's a policymaker in the Ministry of Employment in Denmark, and we're presenting him with a concept. The concept, as you can see, is a whole page of statements about what's the idea, how will it work, who are the users. There's a narrative or a story about how a policymaker could use the idea, and then we're presenting it and receiving feedback from this gentleman and a few others as well. And it's a way at an early stage to show your half-finished work and receive feedback whether it's even worth pursuing or not. And I can tell you in this workshop we had some ideas that looked like they were worth pursuing. So for example, an idea of creating a network across Europe where policymakers can connect quickly with each other to solve problems together. Because the 28 European member states, many of them are facing exactly the same problems. They just don't work on them together. They just come and present them in rooms like this and say a little bit about what they're doing rather than actually getting into workshops and into direct dialogue. So he liked this idea and we moved further with that. It's in our report. You can even find it online now. Another idea was to build a very, very big best practice catalog of what people have done and sharing that with policymakers. We tested that idea as well, and actually that received less of a positive reception because these policymakers said, well, just knowing what somebody did 5 years ago in Greece will not help me design effective policy here in Denmark today. So that's of limited value, and don't spend your time on it. And we could decide not to use resources that way. Another idea of testing solutions is when this example where a director in an agency has an idea and we don't know whether it's a good idea or not. And as you know, when a director in an agency has an idea, normally we have to do it, right? So it's actually quite dangerous when a director in an agency has an idea. You want to avoid them having any ideas at all, actually. But if they have ideas, in this case, we were able to be allowed to test it. The idea was, why don't we in Denmark create a national digital platform where unemployed citizens can find mentors? So a mentor would be someone who has a job, who has a professional network and experience, and can be a mentor for the person who's unemployed. So the platform was just to match people in unemployment with mentors. And that sounds like a nice idea, and if you have the money to invest in that, that might be interesting. It's almost like a LinkedIn for unemployed people. We said, well, let's try it out. Let's try it with two extreme groups. Let's test the idea with girls, people like this girl, who are highly educated, university graduates, unemployed, and see if they could use it and would like it. And then also let us test it with people who are long-term unemployed with a mental disability or mental health problem, who are still in the target group, somebody would still like to get into work. So these are two very, very different groups. And as you can imagine, the model will work quite well for her, except we also find out, speaking of co-production, that her union, the National Association of Economists and Lawyers in Denmark, actually already has a mentor program. So what we need to do is probably to find a way to work with that organization to create the digital platform, and maybe that organization should be the one delivering it and co-branding it with the Ministry of Employment. And in the other case example, when we asked and prototyped and showed citizens an idea for the model who had a mental health challenge, they looked at us and said, well, are you asking us to go and meet strangers on the internet and help us find a job when we have psychological problems? That probably was not such a good idea. So we found that that model would be much better if the ministry would invest in personal meetings and mentorship, where people could interact in person in physical meetings. And that might be something that could be done together with their professional association. So it turned out the director actually had an idea that might be interesting, but it would take a lot of different fine-tuning and changes of it for it to work in practice. And that's the notion of prototyping and testing, is don't do it right away, but try it out first. Another example here is also in prototyping, is we worked with, at MindLab with 3 different agencies: the Agency of Taxation, the Agency for Food Safety, and the Agency for Occupational or Workplace Safety, on what would it be like if we did a single control, a single compliance with businesses, so they don't have to meet 3 different agencies and get 3 different kinds of paperwork and 3 different kinds of regulation, but actually had a single one-stop shop, one-stop point. And what happened here was that we said, well, let's go and explore. Let's do research with the businesses. Let's build an idea for what a digital solution could look like. Let's ask the citizens, ask the business owners, what kind of information would be relevant for you. So in this photograph, you can see one of the policymakers testing out a pamphlet, but it's blank. There's nothing on it. They're just the logos in the top, the logos of the 3 different agencies. What we're doing here is creating or co-designing the content of the information together with the business owner. And we did that, of course, with multiple businesses, and then the second stage was to pilot it with about 1,000 businesses. We even went so far as to create blueprints of what a restaurant looks like and look at the different systems and ways in which businesses are trying to comply with government and working with the different roles of the different agencies in the control. Of course, the food safety agency spends more time looking at the kitchen and hygiene. Workplace safety looks at work functions, and the taxation office is more interested in how they register sales and salaries and so on. So we worked with different creative ways, again, using design, using graphics, for the public servants to find out how they could collaborate in the best possible way. I promised to end with showing you what happened with the taxation office. This is all in Danish, as you can see, and that's for good reason, because this is a new website that went up this spring, 4 years after we did the project with the young man Dennis and his digital abilities on the internet with the taxation office. Now, 4 years later, the office has actually redesigned and launched a specific website that is very, very simple. Top left, it says, Jeg har job, I have a job. But below that, it says, what am I going to do with my taxes? Another one says, I have transport, that's the bicycle. How do I do with my taxes? And so forth. Very, very simple, very user-friendly, and it certainly does not start with technocratic language that nobody understands. The point with this is, I'm very proud that this was done. It showed that this project had an impact, but I'm not so proud that it took 4 years. And it also goes to say a little bit that we need some patience when we work with innovation in governments. I know they had a task force of about 16 people working on this for quite a while at the taxation office, and it's an investment, of course, to do this kind of thing. So we also have to be a bit patient from an idea or from insights until practice. Before I end, I would just, as I promised, say a little bit about what happens with innovation labs. I think it was mentioned in this conference yesterday that the government in Chile has announced a GovLab and is taking very fast steps to establish that kind of team within a government structure. And I had the pleasure actually yesterday to spend quite some time with the team, and it looks, I think, quite promising. And the way I can say it's promising is not only have they gotten, I think, the funding, but also they're asking all the right questions. And that's always a way to find out if people are on track or not, is whether they're asking the right questions. And so this is a photograph from our space at MindLab, but just to say that, you know, all over the globe, leading governments are really beginning to look at, could we maybe invest in structures or institutions that can help us drive innovation more systematically? And I'm talking about governments in the United States, Canada, France, Germany, Singapore, New Zealand, some of those that are right now, this moment, starting innovation teams in various ways. We're also talking about city administrations, city governments, lots and lots of examples around the world. And in fact, almost all of them are building on components of this definition, which is organizations that work actively with end users, organizations that bring in multiple partners and stakeholders that are based on alternative disciplines than the usual ones we would find in government, so including technology, design, social research, ethnography, anthropology, for example. And finally, often organizations that have their own dedicated space, access to workshop spaces, creative spaces, co-working and collaboration. As you can see, this is something that is not entirely new. This report was done, by the way, in 2009. We developed it at MindLab together with the European Commission. You may not be able to read everything on this map, but this is just a map designed by the New School at the University, New School University, Parsons School for Design in New York. Just mapping some of the different labs, and actually I can tell you that a lot of policy scholars right now are spending time and energy on mapping what is going on here. I think I know of the first 5 different projects at universities or other institutions that are mapping the rise of innovation labs in government and what's going on with that. And I'm sure we'll see more of that too. But I know projects in France, in Estonia, here in the United States. And in fact, also there's a very interesting report that I recommend to all of you. It's free, online, downloadable by the British Innovation Foundation, Nesta, and Bloomberg Philanthropies on iTeams. What are these innovation teams like, and 20 case examples of them from around the world. Finally, just to round off, saying that this is really about a leadership challenge. In fact, this head of division is the one, Natasha, who was in charge of the Young Taxpayer Project. And there's a big leadership and management challenge in all of this. What I've talked about is not just about methods and tools and paradigms and theories. It's about organizing and running change within our public institutions. That requires courageous, dedicated, motivated, ambitious leaders who are willing to invest time, energy, and effort in making it happen. Without that, nothing will happen. This is not something we can leave to individual employees. We cannot leave it to innovation teams on their own. We cannot leave it to politicians to say nice things about why we should do this and how it's so important with the citizens. It is very hard, long-term leadership work to make this happen, to create the kind of value we want for citizens and for society. If you want, there are a few books, Leading Public Sector Innovation, that I know actually some people also here in the audience have so kindly used. There's also this new report, Public Sector Innovation in Europe, and I've written a few chapters and books and so forth on this as well. So you're happy to take a look at some of these publications. And finally, I think there will be a folder here today, but actually I have a new book that I've edited coming out called Design for Policy, which has a lot of very, very good contributions from about 18 different individuals across the world who've written chapters on the emergence of design and what that discipline can do for policymaking and for services in the public sector. So I hope you might want to take a look at that. The publishing date is actually not October, it's going to be online, I think, in December 1st. Thank you so much for listening.
Bien, muchísimas gracias a Christian Bason por su excelente presentación. Christian me ha propuesto de que para que efectivamente aprovechemos muy bien la parte de preguntas y respuestas, nos demos un par de minutos en el que ustedes conversen un poco con las personas que tienen al lado y a lo mejor puedan consensuar algunas preguntas. Entonces, nos damos ese par de minutos y después les damos la palabra para las preguntas. Antes de eso quisiera hacer un aviso. El encuentro latinoamericano de políticas públicas, como ustedes saben, consta de estos 2 días de trabajo, ayer y hoy. Sin embargo, quiero avisarles que hay un seminario que está muy vinculado, que organiza el Centro de Sistemas Públicos, del cual les hablaba antes, y que va a ser aquí mismo, en la sede de CEPAL mañana, un seminario que se llama Innovación Pública, Mucho Ruido y las Nueces. Ese seminario que hemos organizado cuenta también con la participación de Christian, también va a estar Christian ahí, va a estar Kevin de Sousa, que es un profesor de la Escuela de Asuntos Públicos de la Universidad Estatal de Arizona, y vamos a tener al equipo del FONDEF que les mencionaba antes, que ha estado trabajando temas de co-creación para la innovación acá en Chile, en particular en el Centro de Salud Familiar. Va a haber también autoridades de la CEPAL y autoridades del gobierno, como las que mencionaba Cristian, justamente, que han estado trabajando en temas de crear aquí un COPLAB. Bien, no les quiero quitar más tiempo, por favor, unos minutos para que redondeen algunas preguntas. Ofrecemos la palabra entonces para, por el tiempo, vamos a ver primero unas 3 o 4 preguntas, cómo andamos con el tiempo para no atrasar la sesión que viene después. Entonces, les ofrezco la palabra. Ok, me habían pedido la palabra acá a Carlos y después acá al compañero.
Primero que nada, compartir con mi colega Patricio Meller nuestra enorme alegría de lo que hemos escuchado. Nos parece extraordinario y nos estamos preguntando qué tendríamos que hacer para que Cristian se nacionalizara chileno y viniera a trabajar con nosotros. Yo ya lo invité a la Patagonia para que nos enamoremos desde la naturaleza. Y la pregunta que nos surge acá fundamentalmente es las raíces de este cambio de paradigma, que es una gran innovación acerca de cómo se piensa la innovación. Quisiéramos saber de dónde viene eso, de los fracasos propios o de la investigación de otras experiencias. Eso.
Hola. Bueno, trabajamos la pregunta con Yesenia del Ministerio del Trabajo. Somos nosotros representantes Arturo Arias y Yesenia González. Nuestra pregunta es esta: ¿cómo trabajar? Son 2 preguntas en una en realidad. ¿Cómo trabajar las expectativas de los ciudadanos, sobre todo cuando las medidas innovadoras no necesariamente son bien recibidas, en consideración a los altos costos impositivos directos o indirectamente, estos costos sociales, el tiempo, la implementación, etc.? ¿Cómo manejar estas expectativas y demandas, la frustración sobre todo de los ciudadanos en reformas tan grandes como en la educación? En la presentación se habló de mecanismos participativos, democratizar la política pública, acceso a datos e información, trabajar con los ciudadanos a través de entrevistas, visitas, pero finalmente estas ideas puede que no sean concretadas en la política pública. A su vez, estos espacios que se generan estas ideas pueden ser también muy superficiales. ¿Cómo convencer a la autoridad política o a los gobernantes electos de la importancia de estos instrumentos participativos?
Bien, gracias. ¿Otra pregunta?
Muchas gracias. Yo quiero hacer la pregunta en inglés y en español. I'm going to ask you in English and I'm going to ask you in Spanish as well. I was speaking with my colleague and we were thinking, we both worked for the government for 3 years, myself for 3 years, you too. And sometimes in government you find agents of change where they want to break the typical constancy that they've been in government for a very long time, and that's very valuable, and their experience is very valuable. But at the same time, sometimes they just don't want to make this change, or they just don't see it happening. And I don't know if it's related to aging or the experience that one acquires, and then maybe me, myself, I'm gonna be the same in the future. I don't know. But what is the role, the specific role of employees, of public servants that are already in the government, or maybe not in the government, but they just don't have this personality or this wanting to change, or the agents of change? Entonces yo acabo de decir que trabajamos 3 años en el gobierno yo, y me gustaría saber cómo poder involucrar a los funcionarios públicos en el cambio de paradigma, para poder hacer estos cambios que realmente sean efectivos y que sean personas que sean agentes de cambio, que sean abiertos a nuevas formas de hacer las cosas, a pesar de que llevan mucho tiempo trabajando en el gobierno. Creo que es una de las cosas, y esa experiencia se valora y se admira, y aprendí muchísimo de mucha gente que lleva 10, 20, 30 años trabajando en el gobierno, pero muchas veces se atrofia porque quizás no quieren hacer estos cambios, o encuentran que es muy nuevo y es muy innovativo, y quizás no, simplemente porque las cosas van a seguir siendo de la misma manera. Esa es mi pregunta. Y gracias a la intérprete, pero quería hacer la pregunta en los 2 idiomas para que se entendiera como quería yo.
Ok, la última pregunta.
Perfecto. Nuestra pregunta, mi nombre es Emilia, y con Sergio estábamos pensando algo que se parece a la pregunta anterior, que tiene que ver con cómo es el equipo del MindLab. ¿Cuáles son las características de ese equipo? ¿Es realmente distinto a los equipos que están implementando en los ministerios con los que trabaja? Y si es que lo es, ¿cuánta transferencia, cuánto ve el MindLab en su rol de transferir esas características, esas cualidades, metodología a los equipos para hacer más sustentable el cambio?
Bien, ok. Muchas gracias por las preguntas.
Well, you are very good at asking questions, both yesterday and today, so thanks. I'll try to be as brief as I can. I'm very known for not being brief in answering questions. So, where does this all come from? Well, some of the ideas we're seeing are, as I mentioned earlier, not new. The notion of co-production formulated by Elinor Ostrom in the early 1970s, that any service and any public service is a relationship and an interaction between citizens and frontline workers, for example. The notion of participatory design and collaboration around designing services grew out of also the 1970s in Denmark and the Nordics in designing software, for example. You're seeing consultancies like IDEO and other design firms have been for a while now talking about iterative, human-centered approaches to product and service development. And you're seeing also other elements of this, which is systems thinking, the new public governance theory and so forth. So I think there's a lot of things coming together here. It's very multidisciplinary, but all of those point in basically in ways which you work in complex systems to create change for real people in the real world. On expectations with citizens, that's a question we get quite often, and I would say that this whole way of working is really about understanding much better and much earlier what can we expect when something we're doing will hit people. So how do we involve people at a very early stage to discover things that will be meaningful or not meaningful to them, and actually reduce the risk of innovation. In Denmark, if you roll out a school reform for 500,000 children without having tested and tried and rehearsed and involved citizens, then you probably will end up in trouble. But if you have involved teachers, students, and other actors in that process of designing the reform, you have a much better chance of being successful. And I'll give you one example about how you also maybe need to work with communications and strategically with that in the public. In Singapore, they recently introduced a paradigm shift in how they treat former prisoners. Singapore is not a country where you've normally been very friendly with criminals. But what they actually decided in government was to implement a policy to invest much more in rehabilitation and retraining and reskilling of people in prison. But they knew that that would not be received very positively, probably in the public. So 2 or 3 years before implementing the reform and saying anything about the reform, they started a public dialogue, a conversation about what this problem is, what can we do about it, and over time they created a different atmosphere in society so that when the reform came, citizens were much, much more prepared and accepting of that quite radical change. Very good question about public servants, staff as agents of change or as agents of resistance. And the challenge is, of course, that what we're saying, for example, at MindLab, when we engage people, is that what we're doing right now is not working well enough. And the people who have been in government for 20 or 30 years are the ones who designed it. So how do we create dialogues and conversations with people who are experienced and who are critical in making decisions and using their skills and tools? How do we have a respectful dialogue? A dialogue where we are not blaming or criticizing, but where we are together exploring how can we do this even better. You know, there are always reasons why policies or services are the way they are today, but they may not fit and match with the future. So I think it's about being very respectful and engaging and collaborative in how we do it. And then also, of course, being ready to recognize where are there some people in our organizations who are never, ever going to be part of the change. And in some cases, in what I've seen, public organizations also must be ready to, honestly, to let people find another job in a different agency or outside of government. And at the same time, how do you identify those people who can be the entrepreneurs, the leaders of the change, and who can be pioneering and be very engaged? So you have to also realize that public employees are different. And we have to realize that, you know, honestly, not everyone may be able to be part of a new future. I know that's very radical and disruptive to some people in some countries where we have a very hard time letting public workers go because of unions, contracts, and so forth. But I think we have to address that issue as well. Finally, the question about MindLab's team. So the key about a GovLab or an I-team is, of course, this should go without saying, that it holds different skills and different competencies than you normally will find in government. So I have a team with people who have backgrounds in ethnography, anthropology, media science, digital interaction design, people who have designers, a regular design background. And I also have people who have a public management background. Of course, a team like that must understand how government works, must be able to work respectfully and engage with public policymakers. And so it also matters that we have a team that also understands that. But we do have some skills that are quite different. And I would say that our role then, the way in which we work is, again, we are not the ones who get better ideas than our colleagues. We are the ones who catalyze and support and facilitate through generating new knowledge, generating new processes that our colleagues, who are the experienced policymakers and have knowledge and have skills and know the organization and know the law, they are enabled to come up with better ideas about what could work.
Bien, junto con darle muchísimas gracias a Cristian por esta excelente presentación, antes de que salgamos quiero, y antes del aplauso que se merece Cristian, quiero una precisión. Aquellos que estén interesados en seguir profundizando en el tema de la innovación y la co-creación en relación al seminario que les mencioné del día de mañana, donde también vamos a contar con Cristian, tendrían que inscribirse, tienen que entrar a www.sistemaspúblicos.cl, en la página del Centro de Sistemas Públicos, y quienes quieran seguir profundizando en este apasionante tema, podemos hacerlo entonces en esta sesión de mañana. Quiero pedirles un gran aplauso para Cristian Beijer.